Welcome to another episode of Was It That Bad? The series where we look at a game which reviewed poorly upon initial release and go back in time to answer the ultimate question. Was it really that bad? Today we're going to be looking at the PC versions of Aliens Colonial Marines, released in 2013 by Gearbox Software. Now the version we're playing includes the most recent official patch, which was released in July 2013, 6 months after the initial release. However, to ensure we are looking at a version as close as we can get to the original experience, we're not using any of the fan patches or additional DLC for the game, although I will touch on these a little later. We're also going to be focusing exclusively on the single player for this review. Now, when the title originally released, it made the news by way of fairly unfavourable reviews and even a lawsuit related to the game allegedly being falsely advertised. Now, I'm not going to go into these details in this video, that's not the objective here, but hopefully you get the idea. It wasn't exactly critically acclaimed upon release. Now, movie to game adaptations are always a dicey topic, and as we examine the game further, we're going to see a trend around expectation management and how this might have impacted people's first impressions. As always, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's begin. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Aliens franchise. I've played most of the mainline games over the years, as well as seeing all of the movies. The story in Aliens Colonial Marines effectively picks up shortly after the conclusion of the initial film and sees you taking the role of one of the Colonial Marines sent to investigate a mysterious distress call. Now, in the reviews of the time, the story was criticised for several elements, some of which I'm not going to highlight here because of spoilers and a genuine belief that I have that it is a story worth experiencing. Now, let's be clear, I don't think we're dealing with the best story created for the franchise here, but for me, as a fan of the series, I found the story fairly enjoyable. A lot of criticism I have read around the story revolves around a lot of unanswered questions, particularly around the initial setting in the first few levels, but I would argue that the series as a whole has used this trope for quite some time. When I saw Prometheus, I walked out of the cinema with more questions than when I walked in, and I'd argue that this element is a strength rather than a weakness. There is a lot of dialogue in the game, and this helps to deliver the story from a mostly first-person perspective, which is nice. People generally like to experience a story rather than just watch one unfold. Now, there are some overused elements of the story, and if I heard the phrase, "we don't leave Marines behind," one more time throughout the story, I think I might have just turned into an alien and started crawling up the wall myself. But for the most part, I believe the story was as good as it could narratively be told within the constraints of the broader film license. Now, the core gameplay of Colonial Marines is first-person shooting, with some squad mechanics thrown in for good measure. It's nothing we haven't seen before, but there are a few minor tweaks that make it a little unique. For example, you have a regenerating health system, but it doesn't regenerate if you are covered in that acidic alien blood, meaning that you sometimes need to slow down your gameplay between combat encounters. What doesn't need to be slowed down any further is your character's movement speed, and this is one of the biggest issues I have with the game. While the control feels fairly responsive, the overall speed of your character is painfully slow. Now, you can sprint, but you have very limited stamina, meaning this isn't overly helpful in combat. This would be fine if the other elements of the game, like level design and enemies, were designed with this much slower movement speed in mind. However, it's somewhat the opposite. The alien enemies close in on you at breakneck speed, and if they get close enough, they'll lock you in a grapple animation where you need to mash a key or melee to escape. I can't express enough how easy it is to get overwhelmed by enemies in this game, particularly in the first few chapters, and a big part of it, I feel, is the lack of mobility available to the player. Now, maybe this was an intentional design decision to increase the difficulty of the game, I don't know, but I can say as someone who's played through it, there gets a time when the challenge quickly turns into frustration. Now, there is a weapon leveling system in the game, kind of like Call of Duty has weapons level up and unlock attachments, which increase particular attributes. And while I think it's novel to a degree, it doesn't really add anything meaningful to the game. and if anything, artificially nerfs the weapons when you initially pick them up, before later having to level them up. The shotgun is a really good example of this. Personally, I would have preferred the developers limit the ammo for the game's more powerful guns, so that they still felt impactful and rewarding when you initially find them, as opposed to having to grind before they become more usable. I wouldn't go as far to say it's a bad system. It's okay. There are going to be people who like this type of thing, but for me, it just wasn't the best implementation of a weapon system. The weapons themselves, outside of the artificial nerfs, are really fun to use, and combined with their secondary abilities, encourage the player to experiment. It's just a shame that a shotgun blast straight to an alien less than a foot in front of you won't down it for the majority of the game. One of the other core gameplay elements is the squad-based system. Now, this isn't a controllable squad like that in Daikatana, but rather an AI squad which joins you for most of the missions. Squad mates are what I like to call a high-risk, high-reward mechanic. When you get it right, it dramatically adds to the overall gameplay loop, immersion, and the overall pacing of the story. However, when you get it wrong, it doesn't just become a frustration, it becomes a hindrance to your overall enjoyment. And after playing through the game's campaign, I can safely say that this game gets squad mates mostly right here. Now, they are not perfect. Occasionally, they'll do things that are unusual. However, for the most part, they support you along the way, helping with the overall storytelling, as well as providing some combat assistance. Now, you're not going to have these squad mates mowing down hordes of enemies. Rather, they support you with occasional fire. But on the flip side, they don't seem to have a health system of their own, at least not one I've encountered, meaning you don't have to worry about babysitting them. Go and watch my Daikatana review if you want to know how I feel about that mechanic. The enemies in the game are broken up into two categories, aliens and humans, and despite how many of the reviewers felt at the time, I'd actually say that the mix between these two is pretty balanced. There are levels where you fight only aliens, there are levels where you fight only humans, and there are levels where you fight both, sometimes at the exact same time. It's pretty good for the most part. Enemy AI is a bit of a mix. The majority of the aliens seem to just have one attack loop, which is basically rush at you, which, while criticised by some, is actually probably quite true to the cinema existence of the species. The human enemy AI is slightly more advanced, but overall I'd say it is just good enough. Now, the environment and overall level design is a definite strength of the game. The game feels like a part of the Aliens universe. All of the locations, all of the environments, all feel like they're lifted directly out of the cinema universe, and that's probably the best praise you can give a movie-to-game adaptation. While you're not exactly going to be travelling all around the galaxy, the environments within the levels all do feel unique, complete with some mini-bosses and puzzle sequences to break up the combat. The overall graphical fidelity of the game is an interesting topic. Personally, I don't think it looks bad, but I don't think it looks great either. It looks like the developers were going for a specific type of lo-fi aesthetic for the game, which works better in some environments than others. For me, it didn't detract from the game, and the overall environment and level design helped negate the desire for higher graphical fidelity. However, I can see the other side of the coin here, and your personal mileage may vary with the graphics depending on your personal tastes. As far as bugs go, I didn't really encounter anything game-breaking, except for an unusual bug which delayed the transition for a cutscene, and a few oddities with enemy and squadmate AI, but honestly nothing too egregious for the time. Sound design is excellent. There's extensive voice acting, franchise-correct weapon and equipment sounds, as well as a great overall soundtrack which fits the mood perfectly. Looking back through the original reviews of the time, several outlets criticised the voice acting, but I have to be honest here, I simply don't understand this criticism. The movie series established the somewhat over-the-top bravado of the Marines, and that's what we're getting here, true to form. Now, the more I read reviews of the time after playing through Colonial Marines, the more I spotted a trend, and that was around expectations. With a franchise as well known and as popular as Aliens, all of its fans have an idea of what a game should be based on their own experiences with the franchise. And when the finished product differs from what that idea is or was, it can lead to criticism. However, I argue that in some cases, not all, it's criticism of how the game portrays elements when measured against their own personal expectations and not that of a broader demographic. This is one of the downsides of movie to video game adaptations, and probably why it's very hard for them to be defined as breakout successes, because when that on-screen experience is not replicated exactly as it were in other media, it's very easy to criticize. Now, I'm not saying that expectation management should be an excuse for every misstep of the game, and of course, in many reviews I read, there were very legitimate criticisms, which while I didn't always agree with all of them, I could certainly respect the underlying explanations. Now, I said earlier that there was a DLC for this game, and that includes a story-focused set of chapters which help fill the void between the first movie and where the game picks up from. This seemed to please people from what I've read online, and in isolation, the DLC, called Stasis Interrupted, is generally regarded quite well. There is also a fan-made mod called Aliens Overhaul, which makes a lot of changes to deliver what the community describes as a much more complete experience. I'll drop a link to that in the video description, and again, a massive thank you to the community members who helped create it. Well, now that we've had another look at the game, we can answer the question we set out to. Aliens Colonial Marines. Was it really that bad? No, it wasn't. Aliens Colonial Marines is like eating good takeaway food. You know it's not going to be overly memorable or something you'll tell your friends about, but it's quick and, importantly, quite satisfying. I enjoyed my time with Aliens Colonial Marines back when it released, and after playing through it again, I still enjoy it. It's far from a masterpiece, but it is an enjoyable romp back into the Aliens universe. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.